Hello and welcome to BYJU'S IAS. Before we begin today's The Hindu analysis, we have a small announcement. This Sunday, that is on the 19th of December, Rohit sir will be conducting a workshop for civil service aspirants who are planning to appear for the exam in 2023. So those who are interested to attend the workshop, don't forget to register by using the link that would be provided in the description box below. So with this, let's get started with the analysis of today's The Hindu newspaper by taking up a column from page number 6 of the Delhi edition. This column, written by Suhirt Parthasarthi, examines the links between fundamental rights and fundamental duties and as well as the conflict between them. This topic is in news because recently there have been voices within the government which seem to be suggesting that our exercise of fundamental rights should be made conditional on our ability to fulfill our fundamental duties. Recently, when the Constitution Day was celebrated on the 26th of November, which marks the adoption of the Indian Constitution in 1949, several senior ministers of the government suggested that there is a need to create a balance between fundamental rights and fundamental duties. For example, the Union Minister of Law and Justice, Kiran Rijiju, seemed to suggest that the country can be made great only if there is a balance between fundamental rights and fundamental duties. Then the Minister for Culture, G. Kishan Reddy, even wrote a detailed editorial in a newspaper emphasizing how important fundamental duties are for the growth and progress of the country. He suggested that if deeper roots have to be established in a diverse and democratic country like India, then the citizens will have to converge their inalienable fundamental rights with their fundamental duties. He even wrote that this debate between fundamental rights and fundamental duties is not just a constitutional debate, but it is a civilizational discussion. But the writer of the column takes a firm stand against these suggestions and argues that allowing the language of fundamental duties to subsume political debates would hit the moral principles of the Republic, and it would also be blatantly unconstitutional. So, to understand both sides of the argument, first we need to understand some of the basic differences between fundamental rights and fundamental duties. See, in our Constitution, fundamental rights are enshrined under Part 3 and they guarantee a set of basic rights to the citizens of India and in some cases even to foreigners. And these rights have been enshrined from Article 12 to Article 35 of the Constitution. Whereas fundamental duties, on the other hand, are enshrined under Article 51A, contained in Part 4A of the Constitution. See, our Constitution makers drew inspiration from the fundamental rights of the American Constitution and guaranteed a wide set of fundamental rights to the citizens. Whereas fundamental duties was added much later to the Constitution in 1976, and it draws inspiration from the Constitution of the Soviet Union. Fundamental rights are essentially defined as a set of basic human rights that are guaranteed to all citizens in order to uphold the principles of equality, liberty, and dignity. These rights apply to all citizens irrespective of their race, place of birth, religion, caste, creed, or gender. Whereas fundamental duties, on the other hand, are a set of moral obligations that have been placed upon the citizens to help promote a spirit of patriotism and to uphold the unity and integrity and the sovereignty of the nation. Through various rulings of the Supreme Court, it has been clearly established that fundamental rights are a part of the basic structure of the Indian Constitution and they cannot be taken away at any cost. However, these rights can be suspended during a national emergency, except for the rights that are guaranteed under Article 20 and 21. Then you should also note that these fundamental rights are not absolute, because fundamental rights come with a set of reasonable restrictions, which allows the state to restrict some of the fundamental rights in certain conditions. Whereas fundamental duties, on the other hand, are not essentially a part of the basic structure of the Constitution and they can be taken away. And you should also note that fundamental duties are absolute in nature. Then when it comes to its coverage, Not all citizens of India can enjoy fundamental rights absolutely. For example, personnel of the armed forces and intelligence agencies are only extended a limited set of fundamental rights on the account of the sensitive nature of their work, whereas fundamental duties extends to all citizens including military personnel. Then the most important difference that you need to note is that fundamental rights are enforceable through the Supreme Court and the High Courts. See, fundamental rights are essentially placing an obligation on the state, and they mandate the state to not take away these rights or erode these rights, thus guaranteeing a set of basic rights to the citizens. In fact, the state is required to perform its duty in enabling the citizens to exercise these rights and create the right conditions where the citizens of India, as the citizens of a free democratic state, can fully exercise and enjoy their fundamental rights. So, if the state is seen to be violating these fundamental rights, or if it is trying to restrict the fundamental rights of the citizens in an unreasonable manner, then the citizens have been provided constitutional remedy where the affected individual can approach the Supreme Court and the High Court seeking the enforcement of these fundamental rights. These constitutional remedies are contained under Article 32 and Article 226 of the Constitution. And if you remember, recently I had discussed these constitutional remedies or the writ petitions in a daily quiz. Through these writ petitions, the citizens can request the court to issue writs against the government for the enforcement of the fundamental rights. Whereas on the other hand, fundamental duties, which places a set of duties and moral obligations on the citizens, are not enforceable through courts. So in short, fundamental rights are a part of the basic structure of the Constitution, and even though they can be amended and even though they can be restricted on certain grounds, it is eventually based on the condition that any amendment or any restriction should respect the fact that fundamental rights are a part of the basic structure of the Constitution. So any amendment or any restriction which is violative of the basic structure can be struck down by the courts as unconstitutional. Whereas fundamental duties, on the other hand, are not essentially a part of the basic structure and they are absolutely amenable. And also note that even though most of the fundamental rights are available exclusively only to the citizens of India, there are a few rights which have been extended to foreigners as well. For example, right to life under Article 21 extends to not just Indian citizens, but it also extends to foreigners. Whereas right to equality in public employment is available to citizens of India and not extended to foreigners. On the other hand, fundamental duties places a set of moral obligations only on Indian citizens and they do not apply to foreigners. Then fundamental rights are largely political and social in character, and they were given a very high priority by the Constituent Assembly in order to protect individual dignity and human rights of the citizens, and as well as to engineer a social revolution in the country to eliminate all forms of discrimination and barriers and to lead the Indian society towards an egalitarian society. Whereas fundamental duties can be political, social, or economic in their character, and they place a set of non-enforceable moral obligations on the citizens in order to enable the citizens to contribute towards national development and as well as to sustain the society and to allow the citizens to live peacefully together. Then with regard to a few fundamental rights, it's only the state which has the obligation to protect and uphold these rights, whereas with regard to few fundamental rights, even individuals have an obligation to not violate these rights. For example, when it comes to right to equality and prohibition of discrimination, especially in matters of public employment, the obligation is entirely on the state. Whereas when it comes to prohibition of untouchability, there is an obligation on both the state and the individuals to jointly work towards the abolition of this social evil. Whereas the moral obligations of fundamental duties is not towards any particular individual, but it applies to the nation as a whole and to the society at large. So if these basic differences between fundamental rights and duties are clear, Let us understand the links between them and the conflict that exists between them. See, we already understood that when it comes to fundamental rights, the duty to make these rights available and not to encroach upon them lies upon the government. So essentially, fundamental rights are restricting the government from breaching or violating the basic rights of the citizens. So that duty or obligation lies upon the government, and this is the generally accepted constitutional position. But however, recently ministers within the government seem to be suggesting that if citizens have to enjoy these fundamental rights, then there is a need to link the privilege of enjoying these rights with the duties that the citizens are expected to perform. It indirectly means that the government is going to honor the fundamental rights based on the condition that the citizens first have to fulfill their fundamental duties. Since this viewpoint is being suggested from within the government, it is important to understand the links between fundamental rights and duties and the conflict that exists between them. See, if you go back to the Constituent Assembly and take a look at the debates that took place, it becomes very clear that our constitution makers placed maximum emphasis on protecting individual dignity, human rights, and for pushing the Indian society towards a social revolution which is free from all forms of discrimination, which could lead the Indian society towards a free and egalitarian society. So it was this vision that drove and inspired our constitution makers to come out with a set of basic rights that were guaranteed through the constitution. During these debates, the Constituent Assembly also discussed whether these rights should be made conditional on the performance of certain duties and responsibilities by the citizens. During this debate, the Constituent Assembly took a firm decision that while citizens are expected to perform a few duties and responsibilities, they cannot be linked with their privilege of enjoying the basic fundamental rights. That is the reason why the constitution makers left it to the parliament and the state legislatures to come out with laws which could define the duties and responsibilities of the citizens. But however, any such law enacted by the parliament or the legislature cannot be violative of the fundamental rights which were guaranteed through the constitution. So this clearly establishes the supremacy of fundamental rights over fundamental duties. See here, the argument is not about whether citizens should be obliged to perform few duties and responsibilities which are needed for the functioning of a society. Yes, in order to sustain the society and to enable the citizens to live peacefully together, we are bound to perform few functions and duties and responsibilities as prescribed by law. For example, the parliament can mandate the citizens to pay taxes. But however, the tax that is imposed through law and how it is enforced upon citizens should be done in a reasonable manner which shouldn't violate the fundamental rights of the citizens. Only then such a law can be constitutionally valid, and this duty of paying a tax cannot be made a condition for the citizen to exercise the privilege of enjoying his fundamental rights. Then one might argue that fundamental rights are not absolute. They come with a set of reasonable restrictions. So if fundamental rights themselves are not absolute, then what is wrong in linking the privilege to enjoy these rights with the obligation of citizens performing their mandated duties? See, here you need to understand that reasonable restrictions were brought in on fundamental rights, not as a precondition on the citizens, but in order to account for exceptional circumstances. For example, your fundamental right to free speech and expression can be curbed by the state on certain exceptional grounds. If an individual is exercising their right to free speech to threaten the unity and the integrity of the nation, or to disrupt friendly relations with a foreign country, or to incite violence and to disrupt public order. So, under such exceptional circumstances, fundamental rights can be curbed by the state, and that is why fundamental rights are not absolute. They come with a set of reasonable restrictions to account for these exceptional circumstances. But however, these restrictions are not a precondition for curbing the fundamental rights of citizens in general. So at any cost, citizens cannot be obligated to perform a set of duties before they are allowed to exercise the privilege of enjoying their fundamental rights. Then, to add to this argument, you should also understand the history behind fundamental duties. You need to get an insight into the context and the intentions with which fundamental duties were later introduced into the Constitution. See, in its original form, the Indian Constitution did not have any fundamental duties. This was a result of the deliberate design that was engineered by our Constitution makers because they clearly realized that in order to protect individual dignity and human rights, complete priority has to be given to the set of basic rights, that is, the fundamental rights, without placing any constitutional obligations or conditions with regard to duties and responsibilities of the citizens. So, with this objective in mind, the Constitution makers were clear that the Constitution should not contain any mandatory duties, but instead they provided for a set of guaranteed fundamental rights. But in 1976, when the then Indira Gandhi government had imposed a state of emergency, the government constituted the Swaran Singh Committee to suggest wide sweeping constitutional changes, especially to deal with internal security threats. During this period of national emergency, several fundamental rights, including the right to free speech and expression, had been suspended. In this context, the Swaran Singh Committee recommended the insertion of Article 51A into the Constitution under Part 4A, which would legally mandate a set of duties upon the citizens. The Swaran Singh Committee not only recommended a list of duties, but it also recommended the provision of punishment if citizens fail to fulfill these duties. But however, this recommendation was not accepted by the Parliament in its entirety, and hence the legally binding nature of Swaran Singh Committee's recommendation was dropped, and only the fundamental duties were accepted and introduced as a set of moral obligations and noble ideals that should inspire the citizens towards contributing towards the country. So when the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act was enacted, which is sometimes even referred to as a mini constitution, it introduced several wide sweeping changes even to the basic structure of the constitution, many of which were seen to be violative of fundamental rights. So through this amendment, Article 51A was added to the constitution, which provided for a set of fundamental duties, which includes a few duties such as cherish and follow the noble ideals that inspired the national struggle for freedom, to uphold and protect the sovereignty, unity, and integrity of the nation, to defend the country and to render national service when called upon, to protect and improve our environment, to safeguard public property, etc. But when the introduction of Article 51A was proposed in the Parliament, the then Law Minister had said that these duties should be made legally binding, which should be enforceable with a strict punishment so that it can deter anti-national elements and those who are trying to subvert the society. So these statements of the then Law Minister and the recommendations of the Swaran Singh Committee and the period during which the duties were introduced makes it very clear that the context and intentions behind Article 51A was to place preconditions and obligations of the citizens, which could then be used as an excuse by the state to curb the rights of the citizens. But thankfully, when Article 51A was introduced, the Parliament dropped the legally binding nature of fundamental duties, and they were only added as a set of instructive moral obligations which the citizens are expected to perform. Then later, after the emergency was lifted, there has been a lot of criticism against the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act and even against the fundamental duties that were introduced. For example, many legal and constitutional experts have pointed out that the fundamental duties are very broad, vague, and they do not make any meaningful difference to the Constitution. So considering this constructive criticism against fundamental duties, and by looking at the context and intentions behind the duties that were introduced, and also by looking at the debates of the Constituent Assembly, and by looking at the minds of the Constitution makers, it becomes very clear that fundamental rights are supposed to remain supreme over fundamental duties. So any attempt to link the two and to place obligations and preconditions upon citizens would be blatantly unconstitutional, and it goes against the moral principles of the Indian Republic and as well as against the basic structure of the Indian Constitution. Now let's take up a column from the text and context page of the online edition of the Hindu, which deals with zero budget natural farming. This column helps us understand what is zero budget natural farming and what are the pros and cons associated with this method of farming. See, of late, zero budget natural farming has gained a lot of acceptance and popularity across the country, and it has even gained quite a bit of global recognition as well. But at the same time, this method of farming has strongly divided agricultural experts and economists as they have serious concerns about this farming method. This topic is currently in news because recently Prime Minister Narendra Modi has given a call for making zero budget natural farming a mass movement. So, as the government scales up its efforts to introduce zero budget natural farming, it has led to serious debates amongst experts about the pros and cons of this method of farming. See, zero budget natural farming was developed and popularized by agriculturalist and Padma Shri recipient Subhash Palekar. He developed this method of farming in the 1990s as an alternative to the Green Revolution. As you might know, the Green Revolution of 1960s and 1970s led to a massive increase in India's agricultural productivity, and it also guaranteed India's food security through self-sufficiency in food production. India achieved this tremendous feat during the Green Revolution by employing scientifically validated methods of farming, which led to the large-scale introduction of chemical-based fertilizers and pesticides, and as well as the usage of high-yield hybrid crops along with intensive irrigation. The large-scale employment of such chemical-based fertilizers and pesticides, along with high-yield variety of seeds and intensive irrigation, did significantly boost India's agricultural productivity and guarantee India's food security, but it also brought along with it a host of disadvantages and side effects. Such large-scale usage of chemical-based fertilizers and pesticides led to environmental degradation and led to the contamination of our soil and water bodies. Also, the introduction of hybrid seeds led to the disappearance of native variety of crops, and the same trend was seen in the animal husbandry sector as well. Then, since the Green Revolution increased the number of external inputs that were needed, it led to very high input costs for the farmers. And in order to meet the high input cost, farmers ended up borrowing loans, especially from money lenders and through informal channels, which ended up pushing farmers into a debt burden, which eventually led to a significant increase in farmer suicides from 1980s. So to break this vicious cycle and to safeguard the environmental interests and the interests of the farmers, Subhash Palekar pioneered zero budget natural farming, which is essentially a chemical-free farming method that relies upon Indian traditional practices. Under this method of farming, there are no external inputs needed, and all the inputs required can be produced by the farmers themselves within their agricultural fields, thereby essentially making farming a zero budget exercise. Then it is also said to be environment friendly as it entirely relies upon natural farming methods, and hence it gained a lot of popularity in India and as well as in few other countries. Initially in states such as Maharashtra, Karnataka, and even Andhra Pradesh, zero budget natural farming was widely adopted, and later the methodology was even recognized by the government and as well as by few institutions of the United Nations. But however, experts have always questioned the scientific basis of zero budget natural farming and have even raised serious concerns regarding its impact on agricultural productivity and food security if this farming method is widely adopted. See, in zero budget natural farming, Subhash Palekar recommends the usage of chemical-free inputs which can be produced within the farm, such as Jivamrit. It is essentially a mixture or a concoction that is prepared using cow dung, cow urine, jaggery, pulse flour, water and soil, which acts as a nutrient supply to the soil and the plants. This concoction is fermented to promote microbial activity, and it has been recommended that around 200 liters of Jivamrit should be sprayed twice a month per acre of land. And if this practice is continued for 3 years, then the entire system is supposed to become self-sustaining. Subhash Palekar has claimed that only one native cow is sufficient to produce enough dung and urine for 30 acres of land, and it is also designed to promote local Indian cattle breed instead of imported cattle breed such as Jersey or Holstein. So while Jivamrit takes care of the nutrient needs and replaces chemical fertilizers, Subhash Palekar recommends the usage of Bijamrit for treating the seeds instead of relying upon high yield variety of seeds. Then instead of chemical based pesticides and insecticides, he recommends the usage of a natural concoction that is made using neem leaves, neem pulp, tobacco and green chilies. Under zero budget natural farming, soil aeration is encouraged along with minimum watering, and intercropping methods are also encouraged. Whereas it strongly discourages the usage of intensive irrigation, deep plowing of the soil, which is believed to erode soil fertility, and it is also against vermicomposting because in preparing vermicompost, an earthworm of European origin is used, known as the red wiggler, which according to Subhash Palekar absorbs toxic metals and is poisonous to groundwater in the soil system. So as you can see, zero budget natural farming leads to chemical free agriculture and promotes natural farming methods based on traditional practices. As the external input cost is very low or even absent, it results in zero budget farming, thereby breaking the debt cycle of farmers and thus helping prevent farmer suicides and as well as the degradation of the environment. But however, critics have questioned the scientific basis of these claims being made under zero budget natural farming. As the government of India has been promoting the method from few years, a study was commissioned in Andhra Pradesh in 2017, and according to the study, the input cost declined sharply, thereby benefiting the farmers, and even the crop yield increased significantly, thereby increasing farmers' income. But there are other studies and examples which point towards the drawbacks of zero budget natural farming. For example, the Niti Aayog has justified the Green Revolution as a necessary revolution which helped India become self-sufficient with regard to its food security, but it does acknowledge the environmental impact and the economic impact on farmers caused from Green Revolution. While acknowledging these drawbacks of Green Revolution, the Niti Aayog has questioned the scientific basis of the claims being made under zero budget natural farming. There have been studies in Sikkim which contradicts the claims being made under zero budget natural farming because following the adoption of this method, a significant decline in agricultural productivity and farmers' income has been noted. Then in 2019, when Prime Minister Modi praised this method of farming during a conference of the United Nations, a team of experts from the National Academy of Agricultural Sciences wrote to the Prime Minister warning about the long-term impact of this method of farming. In their letter to the PM, these experts did recognize the harmful impact of chemical-based farming, but however, they've cautioned against a sudden shift towards zero-budget natural farming, as there isn't enough scientific evidence to back these claims. And in the interest of food security and agricultural productivity and farmers' income, we need to continue relying upon chemical-based agriculture at least for a certain time period before making a fundamental and large-scale shift towards chemical-free agriculture. Then also take the example of Sri Lanka. Earlier this year, the Sri Lankan government imposed an overnight ban on fertilizers and pushed the entire country to adopt organic farming. But within a few months, Sri Lankan farmers started suffering as agricultural productivity and their incomes went down significantly. And eventually, it has pushed the Sri Lankan government to revoke the ban partially in the last few weeks. So while adopting methods like zero budget natural farming, there needs to be sufficient caution exercised by the government, and any promotion of the methodology should be based on scientific evidence. For this purpose, the Government of India and the state governments are funding studies on zero budget natural farming by taking up limited cultivation in few states. And through the Paramparagat Krishi Vikas Yojana, the center is supporting around 8 state governments to test and scale up this method of farming. So, such an incremental shift based on scientific evidence can definitely help us move away from chemical based agriculture. But, however, any sudden large scale shift without a scientific basis could be equally disastrous for Indian agriculture. Now, let's look at this article from page number 1. The Union Cabinet has approved a 76,000 crore incentive scheme for the semiconductor and display manufacturing industry. These incentives will be offered for the setting up of semiconductor and display manufacturing units in India, and this brings the total incentives offered to the sector to 2.3 lakh crore rupees. This is a part of the Indian government's objective to turn India into a semiconductor manufacturing hub, as it provides for both economic and strategic advantages. See, currently, manufacturing of semiconductor chips and display units is dominated by countries such as the United States, South Korea, Japan, the European Union, and China. You can clearly see how these major producers of semiconductor chips and display units have dominated the market, and they are not only reaping the economic benefits, but it also provides them with a geopolitical advantage as semiconductors are employed for strategic purposes as well. Over the last several months, the global economy has been facing a severe shortage of semiconductor chips, and this has significantly affected several sectors and countries, and especially the automobile sector and electronics industry have taken a very big hit. So, India's lack of domestic capabilities in this domain has been a serious economic and geopolitical disadvantage. And hence, to boost domestic manufacturing, the government is providing incentives to the tune of 2.3 lakh crore rupees, which includes the newly approved scheme amounting to 76,000 crore rupees. Through this scheme, the government will extend fiscal support to manufacturing units in India, and the government is going to bear up to 50% of the project cost. To realize this ambition, the center will work closely with the state governments for establishing high-tech clusters where these manufacturing centers can come up, and for facilitating them, all the required infrastructure, including land, physical infrastructure, and semiconductor grade water, will be made available by the center through the state governments. Along with this, the government has also announced the establishment of the India Semiconductor Mission, which will act as a nodal agency for drafting long term strategies for creating a sustainable semiconductor and display manufacturing ecosystem in the country. This mission will be led by global experts and will facilitate the government in the smooth implementation of this ambitious scheme. As discussed, this scheme has both strategic importance and as well as economic significance. Because semiconductor chips are used in critical sectors and strategic sectors as well, and they end up becoming a part of a country's critical information infrastructure. So, this obviously raises cybersecurity concerns because when we are relying upon imported chips, which are being used in strategic sectors like defense, nuclear, communication, etc., there is always a fear that these imported chips might have backdoors which might compromise the cybersecurity of our critical information infrastructure and enable hostile countries to gain access to them to mount cyber espionage and cyber warfare campaigns against India. So, building self sufficiency in this domain is critical, especially for the critical information infrastructure, and helps in safeguarding the country against cybersecurity threats. The scheme will also bring tremendous economic benefits as it will boost India's domestic manufacturing capabilities and will even lead to the creation of lakhs of high skilled jobs by attracting significant foreign investment into the sector. Next, according to this article on page number 11, the US Navy has tested a laser weapon in West Asia. A US naval ship has test fired a laser weapon against a floating target in the strategic Gulf of Aden region. See, the Gulf of Aden is located near Yemen, which has been hit by civil war, where the Houthi rebels, who are sponsored by Iran, are known to target Western interests as well. The Houthi rebels of Yemen are known to operate aerial drones and as well as drone ships which are operated remotely to threaten shipping and navigation in this strategic sea lane of communication. So, to safeguard against these threats, the US Armed Forces have been testing laser weapons to target these remotely piloted and operated drones and ships, which are often used by non state actors like Houthi rebels to carry out terror attacks in the region. This article also provides us an opportunity to understand a few important geographical locations, which can be very useful for map based questions in prelims. See, this is where the Gulf of Aden is located. It is located between Yemen and the Horn of Africa region in Eastern Africa. The Gulf of Aden opens towards the Arabian Sea and connects the Arabian Sea with the narrow Red Sea located over here. While passing from the Arabian Sea to the Red Sea, you encounter a strategic choke point known as the Bab el Mandeb Strait. It is referred to as a choke point because the Bab el Mandeb Strait is a very narrow opening that connects two very important water bodies that play a crucial role in global shipping. That's the reason why small countries like Djibouti gain a lot of strategic significance as they are located next to the Bab el Mandeb Strait. Several major powers like the United States, France, Japan, and even China, they have all established a naval base in Djibouti in order to ensure the stability of this important choke point. Then, as you pass through the Red Sea, you encounter the strategic Suez Canal, which further connects with the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. So, please be aware of these important geographical locations that are located along this important sea lane of communication. Now, let's take a look at the mains practice questions. The first question: should our fundamental rights be linked with fundamental duties? Critically discuss. The second question: what is zero budget natural farming? What are the pros and cons of this method? Kindly write an answer to these questions and post your answers in the answer writing portal, for which the link shall be given in the description box below. So, this concludes our discussion for today. Thanks for watching.